The letter was in his hands before the toast had cooled. Silas Drayton, Duke of Meriden, had opened it with the same idle efficiency he brought to every piece of morning correspondence, a thumb beneath the fold, a single clean tear along the edge, and for several seconds he did not understand what he was reading. The handwriting was familiar, not the hand of his steward, nor his solicitor, nor the endless parade of parliamentary secretaries who sent him notices regarding the House of Lords. This hand was smaller, more deliberate. The ink had not faded so much as mellowed, the way good paper does when it has been stored in the dark, and the sheet itself was heavier than anything in his usual post, cream-colored, slightly yellowed at the margins, carrying the faintest trace of something floral. Across the table, Clemency lifted the butter knife. She did not look at the letter. She did not need to. She had recognized it the moment Poole set it beside his plate among the morning's correspondence, the fold, the weight, the pale gray seal she had pressed into the wax with her mother's ring 3 years ago, in a bedchamber she had not yet learned to call her own, on the morning after her wedding night, while her new husband dressed for a ride he had not invited her to join. She had waited 3 years to learn whether he would ever open it. Now she buttered her toast. The breakfast room at Meriden Park faced east, and on mornings such as this one, late spring, the gardens already lush with the season's first roses, the light came through the tall windows in broad, pale sheets that turned the white linen cloth to ivory and caught the steam rising from the silver coffee pot. It was a beautiful room. Clemency had made it so. When she arrived as a bride, the breakfast room had been a dark, paneled afterthought, the curtains drawn against the morning as though sunlight were an inconvenience. She had asked Mrs. Halkett, the housekeeper, whether the curtains might be changed. Mrs. Halkett had said she would consult the Duke. The Duke had said he did not care, and so Clemency had chosen the curtains herself, pale gold damask that caught and held the light, and the Duke had never mentioned them, and Clemency had understood that his indifference extended to more than soft furnishings. That had been the pattern of their marriage, not cruelty. Never cruelty. Silas Drayton was not a cruel man. He was courteous at dinner, attentive enough in company, punctual in his duties both to the estate and to the House of Lords, where he sat with the quiet conscientiousness of a man who took his obligations seriously without ever taking them personally. He did not keep a mistress, he did not drink to excess. He did not raise his voice, he simply did not see her. Clemency existed in his household the way the breakfast room curtains existed, present, functional, unchanged by his gaze, because his gaze never rested long enough to register what was there. She had not always been invisible to herself. That was the danger of the letter he was reading now, his coffee growing cold, his right hand beginning, almost imperceptibly, to tremble. The letter was proof that there had been a time when Clemency Frith, as she was then, had been foolish enough to hope. Their courtship, if it could be called that, had lasted 6 weeks. Sir Aldrich Frith, Clemency's father, had arranged it with the efficiency of a man settling a land dispute, which, in a sense, he was. The Frith estate bordered the Meriden lands to the south, and a marriage between the families would consolidate the most productive sheep country in the county. Clemency was the eldest daughter, plain-spoken, well-read, and 23, old enough that her mother had stopped introducing her at assemblies with any particular emphasis. The Duke of Meriden was 28, recently come into his title after his father's death, and in need of a wife who would manage his household without requiring management herself. They had met 4 times before the engagement was agreed. Twice at dinner, once at the Frith house, once at Meriden Park, once at a county assembly where Clemency had danced with him because it was expected, and he had danced with her because it was efficient, and once, unexpectedly, in the village, where Clemency had been returning a book to the circulating library, and had found him standing in the lane outside the saddler's, speaking to the saddler's boy about a torn bridle with the same careful courtesy he had shown the Earl of Ashwick the previous evening at dinner. She had noticed that. She had noticed everything. She noticed that he took his tea without sugar and that he stood at windows when he was thinking, not looking out precisely, but orienting himself towards the light as though it helped him see whatever was inside his own mind more clearly. She noticed that his hands were steady, even when he was impatient, and that he listened to his steward Langton with the same seriousness he gave to his solicitor. She noticed that when his younger sister Philippa, who lived in Bath with their aunt, wrote to him about her interest in botanical illustration, he did not laugh, but replied with the name of a printmaker in London who produced fine-quality sketchbooks. These were small things. So small that Clemency could not have explained, if pressed, why they mattered. But they were the things upon which she had built something fragile and unasked for. A hope that this marriage, arranged for sheep and acreage, might grow into something warmer than convenience. She had written the letter to tell him so. It was the morning after their wedding night. The night itself had been what she expected, brief, dutiful, neither rough nor tender. He had come to her room because it was required. He had been considerate in the clinical sense of the word. He had left before the candle on the mantelpiece had burned to its halfway mark. Clemency had lain in the dark afterward, listening to his footsteps recede down the corridor, and had felt not sadness exactly, but a clarifying chill, the kind that comes when one steps outside on a winter morning and understands, in the body rather than the mind, exactly how cold it is. She had risen early. Jessup, her lady's maid, who had come with her from the Frith household, who had pinned her hair for the wedding and unpinned it after, was already awake, laying out a morning dress of pale gray muslin with a high empire waist and long sleeves. Clemency had sat at the writing desk in her new bedchamber, a room that still smelled of someone else's lavender sachets, and she had written the letter. She did not draft it. She did not revise. The words came the way water comes when a pump has been primed, steady, clean, inevitable. My lord, she had written, I know that what passed between us is duty, and I do not ask you to call it otherwise, but I wish you to know that I came to this marriage with something more than obedience. During our courtship, I noticed certain things about you, how you take your tea without sugar, how you stand at the window when you are thinking, how your hands are steady. I noticed that you spoke to the saddler's boy with the same respect you showed the earl, and that you did not laugh at your sister's ambitions. These are small observations, and perhaps they are presumptuous, but they are the grounds upon which I have allowed myself a hope, perhaps a foolish one, that we might in time become something more than an arrangement. I ask nothing of you, save the possibility that you might wish to know me as I have begun to wish to know you. I will not ask again. She had signed it with her new name, Clemency Drayton, because it was the first time she had written it, and she wanted to feel the shape of it under her hand. She had sealed it with her mother's ring, the pale gray wax she had brought from home, because she did not yet have a seal bearing the Meriden crest, and she had left it on his writing desk in the study, propped against the inkwell where he would see it when he sat down to his morning's business. He had seen it. She knew this because she had gone back to the study that afternoon, on the pretense of looking for a book, and the letter was no longer propped against the inkwell. It had been moved to the side of the desk, half covered by a folio of estate accounts, the seal unbroken. He had moved it. He had not opened it. Clemency had stood in the study doorway for a long moment, looking at the small gray circle of wax. Her mother's ring, her maiden seal, the last gesture she would make as a woman who still believed hoping was worth the risk. And she had understood. She did not go back to check again. She did not mention it. She did not ask Jessup to inquire. She had said she would not ask twice, and she had meant it. In the 3 years that followed, Clemency Drayton, Duchess of Meriden, became exactly what her husband had assumed she already was, a perfectly functioning component of his household. She managed the domestic accounts through Mrs. Halkett with a precision that the housekeeper privately found remarkable. She oversaw the kitchens, the gardens, the seasonal staff, the linen stores, the endless procession of small decisions that kept a house of 27 rooms operating without friction. She entertained when required, dinners for the county, a Christmas assembly, a summer luncheon for the tenants, and she did so with a warmth that charmed everyone except the one person who might have noticed it was performance. She read in the evenings, she walked in the mornings, she played the pianoforte after dinner when Silas was present because he seemed to expect it, though he never requested a particular piece, and she suspected he did not hear the music so much as register its presence, the way one registers the ticking of a clock. She corresponded with her father, with Philippa in Bath, and with a school friend in Dorset. She learned the names of every tenant family on the estate. She planted sweet peas along the south wall of the kitchen garden because her mother had always grown sweet peas, and the scent in July made the mornings bearable. Jessup watched all of this. Jessup had been present when the letter was written. She had been laying out gloves in the dressing room when she heard the scratch of Clemency's pen, steady and unhesitating, and she had seen the gray wax pressed and the letter carried out. She never asked what the letter said. She did not need to. She knew her mistress, and she knew what it had cost, and she recognized the quality of the silence that followed. It was not peace, it was architecture. Mrs. Halkett knew too, in her way, not the letter, but the shape of the absence it had left. She had served the previous Duke and Duchess, who had been cold to each other in the manner of people who had once been warm and could not forgive the cooling. This marriage was different. There was no ice to thaw because there had never been heat. The Duchess did not seem unhappy. She seemed completed, as though she had arrived at the final version of herself and found it adequate. Mrs. Halkett did not find this reassuring. She had managed enough households to know that adequacy, in a young woman of 24, was a kind of wound. The letter had surfaced through the most mundane of channels. Langton, the steward, had been clearing the Duke's study in preparation for a visit from the estate's solicitor. Papers to be gathered for a drainage dispute that would require the Duke's attention before the next sitting of the House of Lords in autumn. In the third drawer of the writing desk, beneath a folio of outdated accounts from the previous Duke's tenure, Langton found a small stack of unsealed and miscellaneous papers, old invitations, a tradesman's receipt, a letter from a horse breeder in Newmarket, and among them, a sealed letter on heavy cream paper addressed in a woman's hand. Langton did not open it. It was not his correspondence. He placed it with the morning's post and gave the tray to Poole, who carried it to the breakfast room at 8 o'clock, as he did every morning, and set it beside the Duke's plate between the toast rack and the marmalade. And so the letter arrived where it had always been intended to arrive, in Silas Drayton's hands at his breakfast table, 3 years late and entirely by accident. He was reading it now. Clemency could follow his progress through the letter by watching his hands. The right hand, which held the page, had been steady when he opened it. By the second line it had stilled, not trembling yet, but arrested, the way a man's hand goes still when he touches something unexpectedly hot and has not yet decided whether to let go. By the middle of the page, his thumb had tightened against the margin, pressing a small crease into the paper that she would find later and trace with her fingertip. And by the end, by I will not ask again, by Clemency Drayton written for the first time in a hand that had not yet learned to be careful. His hands were shaking. She watched all of this over the rim of her teacup. She did not hurry. She had waited 3 years. She could wait for him to finish. The breakfast room was very quiet. Outside, a gardener was raking the gravel path, and the sound came through the open window like a slow exhalation, stone against stone, rhythmic and indifferent. A thrush was singing in the copper beech. The coffee pot ticked as it cooled. These were the sounds of an ordinary morning at Meriden Park, and Clemency registered them with the same precision she brought to everything, not because they mattered, but because precision was what she had, instead of hope. Silas put the letter down. He did not fold it. He set it on the tablecloth beside his plate, face up, as though he could not bear to turn her words away from the light. His hands were flat on the linen, fingers spread, pressing down as though the table might otherwise move. He was looking at her. He was looking at her in a way he had never looked at her before, not with affection, not yet, but with the particular devastation of a man who has just discovered that the room he thought was empty has been occupied all along, and the person in it has been watching him not notice her for 3 years. "You wrote this," he said. His voice was not steady. "The morning after our wedding." "Yes." "The seal. You used your mother's ring." "I did not yet have the Meriden seal. It was all I had." He looked down at the letter again. She saw his gaze move across the lines she knew by heart. She had written them once and remembered them always, the way one remembers the exact words of a promise made in earnest. "You left it on my desk, against the inkwell. I moved it." He said this as though confessing to something. "I saw it and I moved it aside. I thought—" He stopped. He did not finish the sentence because there was no way to finish it that was not an admission of exactly what he had done. He had thought it unimportant. He had thought her unimportant. He had not been curious enough about his new wife's thoughts to break a seal. "You never opened it," Clemency said. This was not an accusation. It was a fact, delivered with the same calm she brought to household accounts. "No." "I know." The silence between them was different now. It was not the practiced silence of their mornings, the comfortable mutual absence that passed for companionship. It was charged, fissured, alive. Clemency set down her teacup. The click of porcelain against saucer was very precise. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked. "In 3 years? Why did you never say, 'I was not willing to say it twice'?" The sentence fell between them like a stone into still water. He heard it. She saw him hear it, the way his breath caught, the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes, which were gray and usually unreadable, became for a moment entirely transparent. He understood. She had offered herself once. She had made herself vulnerable once. She had put the whole of her fragile, provisional, foolish hope onto a piece of cream paper and sealed it with her mother's ring and left it where he could not fail to find it. And he had set it aside. And she had kept her word. She would not ask again. Silas Drayton looked at his wife, truly looked at her, perhaps for the first time since he had stood beside her at the altar in the village church and spoken vows he had not troubled to mean. And what he saw was not the composed, competent, invisible woman he had lived alongside for 3 years. What he saw was the cost of his indifference, seated upright in a pale blue muslin morning dress with a high collar and long sleeves, her dark hair pinned simply, her hands quiet in her lap, her face showing nothing because she had long ago decided that showing him anything was a waste of what she had to give. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was very low. "I should like to read it again, if you will permit me." "It is your letter," Clemency said. "It was always your letter." She rose from the table. She left the breakfast room without haste, without drama, without looking back. Her footsteps were steady on the marble floor of the corridor, and Jessup, who was waiting at the top of the stairs with a shawl, saw her mistress's face as she ascended and recognized the expression, not triumph, not grief, but the particular exhaustion of a woman who has carried something heavy for a very long time and has just set it down. "Is everything well, ma'am?" Jessup asked, because she had to ask, though she already knew. "He opened the letter," Clemency said. Jessup said nothing. She draped the shawl, cream wool, fine spun, over Clemency's shoulders and followed her to the morning room, where the fire had been laid but not lit, because it was May and the room was warm enough without it, and Clemency sat in the window seat where the light fell cleanly across her hands. Downstairs, Silas read the letter again, and then a third time. He read it the way a man reads a document he has been given by a solicitor, searching for clauses, for conditions, for the place where the language turns and reveals what is really being asked. But there were no clauses, there were no conditions. There was only a young woman's honest accounting of what she had noticed about him, and a single request to be known, and the quiet promise that she would not make the request again. He folded the letter along its original creases, and as he did so, he noticed something he would not have noticed 3 years ago, when he was the kind of man who set aside unopened letters from his wife. The fold was exact. The creases were sharp. This was a woman who folded things precisely, who brought care to small actions, who did nothing carelessly. He had not known this about her. He had not known that she planted sweet peas. He had not known that she played Handel in the evenings, because it was the composer her mother had preferred. He had not known that she wrote without drafting, that her handwriting did not hesitate, that her gray seal meant she had come to him with nothing of his and everything of her own. He had not known any of this because he had never looked. The days that followed were not easy. Clemency did not soften because he had finally read her letter. She did not suddenly become warm or open or forgiving. Forgiveness would have required anger, and she had spent her anger long ago, spent it quietly, in private, in the months after the wedding when she would lie awake listening to the house settle and wonder whether the man sleeping 20 paces down the corridor had yet broken the gray wax seal. When she stopped wondering, she stopped being angry. What replaced the anger was something more durable and more frightening, a settled architectural composure that had no doors. Silas tried, clumsily at first, to find the doors. He came to breakfast earlier. He asked what she was reading, and when she told him, he listened. He inquired after her father, and when she said Sir Aldrich had been unwell, he suggested they might visit. He told Langton to consult the Duchess on the drainage dispute, and when Langton looked surprised, Silas said, "She has been managing this household for 3 years. I should think she understands its needs better than I do." Clemency received these gestures with courtesy and without warmth. She answered his questions. She gave her opinion on the drainage. She agreed that a visit to her father would be sensible. But she did not offer anything beyond what was asked, and she did not initiate conversation, and she did not look at him the way she had once looked at him across a lane outside a saddler's shop in the village. With attention, with curiosity, with the beginning of something that might have been love if it had been given room to grow. He understood that he was asking her to do the thing she had promised not to do. He was asking her to ask again, and she would not. She had said so, in writing, and she was a woman who kept her word. So he stopped asking her to come to him, and he went to her instead. He learned her routines from Mrs. Halkett, not by inquiring directly, but by paying attention, which was the thing the letter had asked of him and the thing he had failed to do for 3 years. He learned that she walked in the garden before breakfast and that she spent the hour after luncheon in the still room, where she kept a ledger of the estate's preserves and tinctures with the same meticulous hand that had written the letter. He learned that she took her tea with a half-spoonful of sugar and a thin slice of lemon, and that she preferred the window seat in the morning room because the light there was best for reading, and that she did not like cut flowers in her bedchamber because she preferred them alive, in the ground where they belonged. He learned these things the way she had once learned things about him, by watching, by being present, by allowing himself to be changed by what he observed. It was not comfortable. Silas Drayton was not a man accustomed to discomfort, and the process of seeing his wife clearly required him to also see himself clearly, which was worse. He saw a man who had been given something rare and had not recognized it. He saw a man who had filed away a love letter with old receipts. He saw a man whose steadiness, which he had always considered a virtue, was in fact a kind of sleep. The first crack in Clemency's composure came 6 weeks after the letter was opened, on an evening in late June, when the light lasted until nearly 10 o'clock, and the drawing-room windows were open to the garden. Silas had come to sit with her after dinner, not because it was expected, but because he wished to. And he had brought with him a small book he had found in the library, a volume of Cowper's poems that had been inscribed on the flyleaf in a woman's hand, for Clemency, on her 15th birthday. With love, Mother. I believe this is yours, he said, and held it out to her. It was on the 3rd shelf behind the atlases. I do not know how it came to be there. Clemency took the book. She opened it to the flyleaf. She ran her thumb across her mother's handwriting, the same hand that had taught her own, the same careful, unhesitating script. And for the first time in 3 years, Silas saw something move behind his wife's composure. Not tears, not quite. But the stillness shifted, the way a surface of ice shifts when warm water moves beneath it, and her breath caught, and she held the book against her chest for a moment before setting it in her lap. "Thank you," she said, and then, after a pause that contained years, "That was thoughtful. It was not much. It was not the letter returned, not hope restored, not the gray wax seal pressed again with her mother's ring. But it was a door, not opened but acknowledged. It existed. It could, in time, be tried." The trying took months. It took Silas learning to sit in silence without filling it, because Clemency's silence was not emptiness. It was the space in which she had lived for 3 years, and he could not enter it by talking. It took him writing to Philippa in Bath and asking about the botanical illustrations, and sharing Philippa's reply with Clemency at breakfast, because it was a thing he might have done 3 years ago if he had been the man the letter believed he could be. It took Mrs. Halkett quietly observing that the Duchess had begun leaving the morning room door open when she read, where before it had always been closed. It took Jessup pressing a morning dress with particular care, a cream muslin with embroidered sprigs at the hem that Clemency had not worn since the early weeks of her marriage, and noting that her mistress chose it without comment on a Tuesday in August when nothing of significance was planned. It took Silas, on a cold evening in November, standing at the study window where Clemency had once left a letter against the inkwell and writing one of his own. He did not seal it with wax. He folded it once and left it on her pillow, where she would find it after Jessup had turned down the bed. It was shorter than hers. He was not a man of many words, and he had spent a lifetime using precision as a substitute for feeling. But what he wrote was this: "I have read your letter 40 times. I cannot answer it as it deserves, because the man to whom it was addressed did not exist, not then. I'm trying to become him now. I ask nothing except that you might allow me to continue trying. I will not stop." Clemency read it by candlelight, sitting on the edge of her bed, in a nightgown of white cotton with a high collar and lace at the cuffs. She read it twice. She pressed her hand flat against the page, the way he had pressed his hands flat against the breakfast table on the morning the world changed, and she felt the impression of his pen, the pressure of a man who had written carefully, who had chosen each word, who had not drafted because he had learned from her that the truest things are written once. She folded his letter and placed it inside the small cedar box on her dressing table, the box that had belonged to her mother, the box that smelled of home. She placed it beside her mother's ring, the one she had used to seal the gray wax, and she closed the lid, and she sat for a long time in the candlelight, listening to the house settle. And for the first time in 3 years, the sound did not feel like loneliness. It felt like a house in which two people were awake at the same hour, thinking of each other, separated by 20 paces of corridor and 3 years of silence and the whole impossible distance between indifference and attention, and beginning, slowly, to close it. By the following spring, the distance was not closed. It would not be closed for years, perhaps never entirely, because some silences leave marks the way frost leaves marks on glass, visible long after the thaw. But the marriage had changed. Silas came to breakfast not out of duty, but out of desire. The desire to see his wife in the morning light she had chosen by changing the curtains, to ask what she had read, to tell her about a letter from the solicitor, or a vote in the House of Lords, or a foal born in the stables at dawn. Clemency answered him. She began tentatively to tell him things he had not asked, that the sweet peas would need staking soon, that Mrs. Halkett's niece was to be married, that she had dreamed about her mother and woken peaceful. These were small offerings. She made them without ceremony, without emphasis, the way one sets a cup of tea before someone who might or might not drink it. Silas drank. They were not, by any accounting, a passionate couple. They would never be the kind of husband and wife who drew attention at assemblies for their evident devotion. But they were, gradually, painstakingly, through the slow accumulation of mornings and evenings and cups of tea and books retrieved from behind atlases, becoming known to each other. And Clemency, who had once written, "I ask nothing of you save the possibility that you might wish to know me," found that the possibility, arriving 3 years late and entirely by accident, was enough to build on. Not because she had lowered her expectations, but because the man who was trying to meet them was doing so with the same steadiness she had once admired in his hands, the steadiness that she now understood was not indifference, but the way he held himself still when he was most afraid of doing the wrong thing. Jessup was the first to notice that the morning room door stayed open through the winter. Mrs. Halkett was the first to notice that the Duchess had asked for a second place to be set in the study on afternoons when the Duke worked at his accounts. Langton was the first to notice that the Duke had begun consulting the Duchess on estate matters not through the steward but directly across the breakfast table, as though her opinion were as natural to seek as the Morning Post. Poole, the footman, noticed nothing. He continued to deliver the correspondence at 8 o'clock each morning, arranging it beside the Duke's plate between the toast rack and the marmalade. And if the Duke occasionally paused before opening a letter, if his hand sometimes hesitated over an unfamiliar seal, Poole attributed it to nothing more than the ordinary caution of a careful man. Their daughter was born on a February morning, 2 years after the letter was opened. They named her Frances, after Clemency's mother. She had Silas's gray eyes and Clemency's habit of watching. She would lie in her cradle, studying the faces above her, with a concentration that Mrs. Halkett called remarkable, and Jessup called familiar. 7 years after the letter was first written, 4 years after it was opened, Frances Drayton, aged 2 and walking with the determined unsteadiness of a child who has recently discovered that the world is larger than a nursery, found a piece of folded paper in the third drawer of her father's writing desk, where she'd been placed for 3 unsupervised minutes while Langton fetched a misplaced key. The paper was old. It was cream-colored. It had been refolded many times along the same creases, the edges softened by handling, and it was tucked not beneath a folio of old accounts, but in the front of the drawer, where it could be reached easily, where it had clearly been read and refolded and read again. Frances carried the letter to the breakfast room, because that was where her parents were, and because she was 2 and everything she found was a gift to be delivered. She walked through the doorway on unsteady legs, holding the paper above her head like a small flag, and presented it to her father, who was sitting at the table with his coffee, reading the Morning Post. Silas took the letter from his daughter's hand. He looked at it. He looked at Clemency, who was sitting across from him in the pale gold light of the curtains she had chosen, a cup of tea before her, half a spoonful of sugar, a thin slice of lemon, wearing a morning dress of cream muslin with embroidered sprigs at the hem. He did not need to open it. He knew every word. He looked at his wife, and she looked at him, and between them passed the whole weight of those 3 years. The gray wax, the unbroken seal, the silence that had nearly become permanent, and also the whole weight of what had come after. The book of Cowper, the letter on the pillow, the morning room door left open, the sweet peas staked together on an afternoon in May. Again, said Frances, because she was 2 and believed that all good things bore repeating. Silas smiled. It was not a large smile. He was not a man of large gestures, and Clemency, who had learned to read him the way she read everything, with attention, with patience, with the willingness to find meaning in small things, did not need a large gesture. She needed only this, his hand reaching across the breakfast table, the letter held gently between his fingers, offered back to her as though it were not a piece of old paper, but the first honest thing that had ever passed between them. Again, he said quietly, yes. Clemency took the letter. She held it for a moment, the weight of it, the softened creases, the faint ghost of lavender and cedar that had somehow survived 7 years in a desk drawer, and she set it beside her plate, next to her teacup, in the morning light. She did not open it. She did not need to. She had written it once, and she had meant every word, and the man across the table had finally, after years of silence, after months of trying, after learning to see what had always been there, become the man she had believed he might be when she pressed her mother's ring into gray wax and hoped. Frances climbed onto her father's lap. Clemency buttered her toast. The morning was quiet. The light was good. If you have found your way here, to this room where silence becomes something worth keeping, know that others have found it too. They arrive here, like a letter opened at last and held gently, whenever they are ready.